When doing the reading section on the new SAT, when you read the passage, should you just summarize each paragraph or anything else to look for and how? So a lot of this gets into my reading passage strategy. I actually, in the previous live stream, talked about this. I gave a general outline. So if you look up live stream highlights number 4, I give an outline of my reading passage strategy. To answer the first question, no, I don't think it's actually useful at all to summarize each paragraph or to annotate each paragraph or underline or mark up. None of that stuff is super useful because in the end, if it doesn't help you answer questions, it's a waste of time and energy. The focus should be on questions. So the gist of the way I approach SAT passages is as you read the passage, you're doing the questions specific to general. So you're essentially reading the passage in chunks in order to answer specific questions as you work through them. So I don't recommend, for example, reading through the entire passage before you go to the questions, or reading through the entire passage and marking it up, or summarizing paragraphs, annotating it. Generally not a great use of time. Now, that said, if you do that and you do well, go for it. But I'm really speaking to those people out there who don't really have a strategy, don't really want a place to start with a strategy. And as I recommend, you read the passage as you answer the questions, and you develop then a sense of what's going on in the passage as you do that. Also about SAT reading, which I'm guessing is going to be the hot topic for all kinds of reasons. Generally, it's the section that people have the most trouble with. So I know that we should start with the easiest passage in the SAT reading. For example, I find it the science passages. But in some tests, the science is the hardest, even harder than the literature and history. That affects my time. So what should I do to solve the problem? So yeah, it's a trend, right? Sometimes, yeah, like the science passage, if you find that generally easier, sometimes it ends up being the hard one. And there's no way to predict that. But that's why we do trends, right? Most of the time, the science will be easier for you. So therefore, we will do it first. Most of the time, maybe this applies to you, it applies to many students, most of the time the history will be the hardest, so we tend to do that last. Sure, there's going to be some variation, there's no way to predict it, but I would rather go in knowing, okay, I'm going to do what generally is easier for me first and leave what's generally harder for me last. Sometimes that gets messed up because sometimes the science actually ends up being really hard and maybe the history is actually easier, but it's a trend, right? Rather than what's the alternative? The alternative is just to do them in order. Well, what's the point of that? Doing them in order, we're just kind of leaving up to complete chance what's easy, medium, or hard. And we also know that the history passage, for example, is going to be like hard no matter what. So maybe don't worry so much about which ones to do first. It's more important which ones to do last. So history passage last, dual passage last, fiction passage last. Whatever's hard for you, do that at the end, and then anything else left, do that first. So yeah, you might get some variance, but I think it's much better than just kind of doing it randomly in order, just because that's the way it's presented. So this is another question about reading, about the two-part questions. So as you probably know, there are questions on the SAT that require you to bring this down, to do two parts. So you've got to answer the question and then provide evidence for it. And this is a question related to that. For the evidence questions in SAT reading, why should I not start with part 2? I'm aware that sometimes when you get the wrong answer in 2, part 1's wrong, but sometimes solving 2 will help me finish both parts faster. So this gets into the specifics of the strategies that I talk about in my reading course about how to tackle the 2-part questions. The gist of it, and I go into more detail there, is when you've got those 2-part questions, let me actually get an example one out. So this is from a random test. We're not actually going to do the question. I'm just using it as an example. So what I generally recommend is to do the first question first on its own, as if there were no part 2. And then usually when you get the answer to this one, you can say to yourself, okay, what evidence in the passage led me to this answer? Because that's always how it should be, right? You always should be getting evidence, something you can point to in the passage that leads you to the answer to any reading question, much less a question like this. And then usually if you say, okay, I got the answer here as B and I saw that in line 79 or something, well, that basically answers part 2 instantly for you. That's the best thing to do. Now, generally, I don't recommend starting from these lines and then trying to find the answer. Now, in response to your specific question, yeah, sometimes it can work out for you to start with these and then use those to find the answer, but it can also lead to danger. So try to do it on its own first If you're having problems, then look at the lines and see if it helps. The problem where students get into with doing it that way, though, which is why I warn against it, almost as a last-ditch effort you can do it, is too often what students will just do is they'll read this line, they'll read these lines, read these lines, read these lines out of context, just kind of reading them separately, and then try to match them to choices. And that's really dangerous because they're going to have, let's say A is wrong, but maybe A lines up with A in 31, which is also wrong. So if you see that they connect, you might be tempted to say, oh, look, A and A, those connect together, so that's the answer. But that's totally irrelevant to answering the question. So the danger with starting with these choices is just kind of out of context, linking them with choices up here, and then having that help you answer the question, because a lot of times that's going to lead you to traps. It's much better to read the passage as it is, find the answer as best you can here, and then these lines usually drop out pretty easily. So I go into a lot more detail about this in the course, but that's the general reason why I recommend do this first and then do that one, rather than doing this to help you find this. It's much better to go the other way around. In the SAT essay, sometimes it is very hard to find 3 rhetorical strategies, so I tend to choose somehow general and weak rhetorical strategy to save time. So what should I look for to find the most important 3 rhetorical strategies? So there's no passage is going to be the same. So I can't say, here are the 3 strategies that you'll always find, or here is what you should always look for to find the 3 strategies, because they're all different. What's important is to know what strategies exist. So in the essay course, I actually have a list. If you're not enrolled already, I've got a free SAT essay course on my site. Goes through everything you need to know for SAT essay and includes some cheat sheets and worksheets and helpful stuff. And one of the things it includes is a list of rhetorical strategies that you can look at. And you want to learn that list because you want to be able to read the passage looking for things like that. So I can't tell you the 3 things to look for, like what will help you find the most important 3 strategies. Learn the list. Know, for example, in evidence that in the evidence category, that it can be things like statistics, it can be scientific studies and citations, it can be quotes from people, it can be experimental evidence, data, whatever it might be, facts of some kind. Those would be useful things to look for. In logical reasoning, could be things like cause and effect, analogies, reasoning from specifics to general or general to specific. I go through all these in that resource. In the persuasive elements category, it's things like appeal to emotion, appeal to authority, exaggeration, understatement, vivid language, tone. So you need to know these so that when you're reading through the passage, you're on the hunt for them, you're on the lookout. If you don't know what these strategies could be, it's hard to find them. So that's the thing I would do here, is make sure you learn, memorize, whatever, those lists of strategies. It's not everything. There are other strategies that are not on that list, but it's a really handy thing that you'll be able to find basically enough for any passage that you're looking for. Audience, a company of adults at the stadium, which is correct. A company of adults or a company of adults. So they're probably, again, it depends on the full sentence, but almost always those are going to be interchangeable. So having a dash around each part of that phrase, so dash here and a dash here, or a comma here and a comma here, basically the same. Again, it depends exactly on the sentence. Maybe there's a slight difference that might maybe lead us one toward the other. I would be surprised. Most of the time on the SAT and the ACT, dash dash or comma comma around a positive like this are essentially equivalent. They're both fulfilling the same functions. In real life, there is more of a difference. Just on the SAT and ACT, there's not. In real life, there's more of a difference in emphasis. So when you use dashes, you're putting more emphasis on that phrase, whereas commas downplay the phrase a bit more. But that's not really something they're going to test on the SAT or ACT. So for all intents and purposes, again, depending with the caveat of sometimes weird things happen in specific questions, dash, dash, comma, comma are equivalent. So you're never going to have to choose between them. On the other hand, dash, comma, or comma, dash is never right because you got to be consistent. Either you use 2 dashes or 2 commas, one or the other, but you don't mix and match. That's for sure. And as always, it's hard to give great answers without having specific passages, because this is a question about basically main idea, which choice best summarizes the passage's main argument. So I can't give you a step-by-step procedure because it depends on every single passage is different, but I can give you a few things to look for. The first thing to not get tripped up by is don't get tricked by choices that mention passage details. So often what they have on these questions is they'll have one, maybe two choices which mention something that was in the passage, but why they don't end up being correct is because they're details mentioned in the passage. They don't capture the main argument. You want a choice, and this gets into the second point. You want the choice, the right answer will cover the highest ratio of the passage. So in other words, the right answer, instead of just being about a detail, which sure maybe is in the passage, but is not the main idea, is going to summarize the most of the passage that's possible. Maybe not everything that's in the passage, but a good chunk of it, right? More than half, certainly. So the trap choices are going to be things that are in the passage, but it doesn't matter if it's in the passage if it's not a main idea. The focus is on the main idea. So get something that's more summary, that's more about the passage as a whole, rather than a detail here or a detail there. Now, of course, the answer has got to be based on the passage on some level, but don't get sucked into those choices which mention a word or a phrase or an idea. It's got to be something in the passage as a whole. Okay, so this was more, it seemed to be about in the writing passage. So that was for the reading passage. What about in the writing? The writing for SAT, you will very, very rarely see this. In fact, can I even think of one that does? But even if you did, the same lessons would be true there as well. Don't get sucked into one fragment of something mentioned somewhere in the passage. It's got to cover the majority of the passage as a whole, not just a small piece of it. I heard that in the SAT March trial in the United States, they added additional reading section. Is that true? And if it's true, will it be applied in all trials? My guess is what this is referring to is the experimental section. So what they've done, they said they weren't going to do this, but because they've gone back on it, I wouldn't see how they wouldn't be able to do this. It makes sense that they would go back and do it. It just thinks that they have to. Basically what happens is, I believe it's only in the United States. I don't think they're doing this internationally, but we'll see. If you're not taking the essay, what they have you do is stay after section 4 and have you do a section 5. Now here's the thing. It doesn't count towards your score. It could be a math, it could be a reading, it could be a writing. It doesn't count towards your score. So as soon as you finish section 4, the math, no math calculator permitted, your test is done. However, again, if you're not taking the essay, they may have you take an additional section. We call this the experimental section. Essentially, they use this to test future questions. They use it for statistical gobbledygook. It doesn't count towards your score. Now, they kind of don't want you to know that, because if you know that, then you don't try as hard on it, and the data they get from it is not as accurate. But that's the way it is. They may not advertise to you that, oh, this is fake, this is just for us, don't worry about it. They want you to be as realistic as you can with it. So I would not say to bomb it. Don't just like put nothing for it, because you don't want to just draw any attention to your test. So do try on it to some extent, but it's not going to count. So don't freak out if it's weird, if it's different than anything you've ever seen. It doesn't count. It's just their way of testing new questions. So do it, but do it with the safety that it's not going to affect you in any way. How to make ratios for similar triangles. So what you want to look for, let's say we have two triangles. This is a general thing we can talk about. Let's say we've got two triangles. They look like this, and we're going to call them ABC and DEF. And we want to set up proportions in these triangles. The first thing we need to do is determine which sides are corresponding, which sides link to one another. And the first thing is either we're told these are similar, or we determine through various means that the three angles of the triangles are congruent. So pink equals pink, green equals green, blue equals blue. Once we see that, this is the angle-angle theorem of similarity, we know these triangles are similar. And now we know we can set up proportions. So what you need to pay attention to, it's kind of two ways to look about it to find corresponding sides. Either for a given side, let's say side AC, look at the angles that it's associated with, that it's kind of made up of, the pink and the blue, and the side in the other triangle will be the one that is pink and blue. So AC corresponds to DF because they're both the pink and the blue side. Or you can look at the angle across from the side, which is probably easier. So the side across from the green angle corresponds. So AC to DF, AB and DE, and then BC and EF would be corresponding. So when you're looking for corresponding sides, you actually pay attention to angles. That tells you which sides link up. And then once you've done that, you can create all kinds of ratios. So you could do AC is to DF as AB is to DE, or BC is to EF. Or you could mix the triangles together. You could do AC is to BC, so basically the green angle to the pink angle, as DF is to EF. So again, green to pink. So there's a lot of different ways to do this, but the key is to find those corresponding sides in the first place. And then once you do that, just be consistent with the ordering. Either put the same triangle in one fraction or put the same triangle on the top and the bottom. Be consistent. Follow up, what if those triangles are inside each other? It's the same idea. So this is actually often what you'll see on the SAT. Let me actually save this and then make a new one because we are out of room. So the question about similar triangles, what if they are inside each other? So let's say I had something like this and something like this. Same thing applies. You have to find the corresponding angles or corresponding sides. So let's say we had A, B, C, D, E. We know, for example, let's say these are both right angles. So we'll call those our red angles. We know they both share this angle A, right? Triangle ADE and ABC both have this angle A, so that's the same. And we know, therefore, that these angles, make these blue, must then be congruent. Because once you found two angles are congruent, you know the third has to come along for the ride because the three angles have got to add up to 180. So what do you do in this situation? It's the same thing. What sides would be corresponding? So I could do AE is to AB. This is the side across from the blue angle, AE and AB, as let's say DE is to BC, so the two sides across from the green angle, right? It's the same thing. Just pay attention to where your angles are and find which ones correspond based on which ones they're across from or which ones they're composed of. So like BE is across from the green, but it's also in between blue and red. It just depends on how you like looking at it. I like doing it across from the angles. It's usually easier to follow. In the reading section, how often can I skip questions? So if I skip every hard question, will that help in any way? So first thing, as you probably know, we never completely skip a question. There's no reason not to guess. So on the SAT, you should definitely at least guess on every question, even if you don't have an answer for it. You should put down an answer. Now that said, the question's getting to, you know, how often can I guess on, basically. The only way skipping questions will help is by skipping questions if it gives you more time to work on easier questions and you get those right and then you get some of the hard ones. That is preferable to spending time on hard questions and then having to rush through easier questions later. So skipping isn't in itself a good thing. It just comes back to the general principle for all tests, whether it's SAT, ACT, whatever. Get easy stuff done first. Anything that's hard, time-consuming, skip it, come back to it later. Finish all the easy stuff that you can find, and then worry about the hard material. What's the difference between a semicolon and a colon? So for more details on all of these grammar rules, I recommend checking out my writing course. It's on YouTube. I've got videos on semicolons and colons and everything, and I go through a lot of detail on this. So I'm just going to give you the basic rundown. Very, very simple rundown. As for the difference between a colon and a semicolon, there's a little bit more detail here, but this is the general rule. For a semicolon, the rule is you must have two complete sentences separated with a semicolon. You must have this. There's no, well, in real life, there's different situations where you might use a semicolon, but for the purposes of the SAT and the ACT, when you have a semicolon, it must separate two complete sentences. This is a rule you can take to the bank, and this comes up I don't know, 5, 6, 7 times per test. So if you don't know this, you're going to feel some pain on questions like these. With a colon, the rule is you must have a complete sentence before the colon, but then literally anything can follow it. It doesn't really matter, grammatically at least, structurally, what follows it. It could be a word, it could be a phrase, it could be a whole sentence. All that matters is you must have a complete sentence before the colon. And that's the general breakdown, and that's the rule. And this will apply basically on every single question. Now, there's some nuance to this, but if you know these rules, these two right here, you'll do a lot better on semicolon and colon problems. When does one use a dash in grammar? So again, there's using dashes in real life, which is one issue, and then there's dashes on the SAT and ACT, which is what we're going to talk about. So we're just going to focus on the narrow use of dashes in the SAT. And dashes basically stand in for two other kinds of punctuation marks. They can basically be used like commas can be used, and they can be used like colons can be used. So to go back to this, a colon and a dash can be used in the same way. So the rule that applies for a colon can also apply for a dash. For commas, the way the dash can work is as a mechanism to set off what's called a non-essential phrase, basically extra information that tells you something about a noun in the sentence. So here's an example. You could have a sentence like this. Very simple sentence, but it does the job. So my brother, a physicist, is visiting. Notice we have two commas surrounding that a physicist phrase. Or you could use dashes to do the same thing. This is what we mean by dashes and commas can be interchangeable in these situations. The main thing with dashes like this and commas is you can't mix and match. So I can't have, a comma here and a dash here, or vice versa. It's either comma, comma, or dash, dash, and they'll never make you choose between comma, comma, dash, dash because they're equivalent. How do you tell whether to use a comma or dash? I assume you mean in this scenario. It doesn't matter, they're equivalent. You will never have to choose between this and this because they're the same. If it looks like you have to choose between them, then there's something else going on unrelated to those that might make the choice go one way or the other. Just so everyone knows, I'm going to try to keep the pace up because I imagine as we get more crowded, I'm going to be kind of overflowing with questions. So I'm going to try to keep the pace up, but feel free to follow up in chat. How do you save time on the reading section? Main thing is, again, everyone has different strategies, but my particular approach is don't waste time reading through the passage before you go to the questions. I generally advise starting with the questions, finding a specific question to do, reading the passage until you can answer that question, and then moving on to specifics. I go into a lot more detail about this in my courses and on my YouTube videos. So if you check, I think Just Pick C, I think my YouTube video series on this, I went through this in some detail. But basically it's don't read the passage up front. Go to the questions and use the questions as you read the passage. What do you have to do to score high on the writing? So you have to know grammar, well, two things. First thing would be grammar rules. You must know your grammar rules because the thing about the writing section, very repetitive. It tests the same rules again and again and again and again. And if you know those rules, like comma rules, semicolons, dashes, subject-verb agreement, sentence structure, pronoun agreement, all tense, all these rules, if you know them, you know what to expect. The second thing are rhetorical skills, we'll call them rhetorical skills questions. These are those questions which are about like adding a sentence, removing a sentence, rearranging sentences, not so much about grammar, but more about the essay or the passage as a piece of writing and how it effectively communicates what it wants to communicate. And for these, I came up with, again, you can just go on YouTube later and search for Reason Prep 4 Principles, SAT writing. SAT writing 4 principles, and you'll find a video that explains exactly how to find, what to look for to answer rhetorical skills questions. Question about SAT math. Do I need to know trig for the SAT math section? Yes, but in your follow-up question, you said like pre-calc, not as far as pre-calc. So let me give you the list of the things you need to know for trig. I will say you're probably only going to see 1 to 2 questions per test on trig. And the most common ones you're going to see are questions involving SOHCAHTOA, so just general right triangle geometry with sine, cosine, and tangent. You're going to need to know radians and degrees. So how to convert from radians to degrees, how to find the central angle of a circle in radians and degrees, things like that. What else? There's not much. It's very narrow. There's one other thing that I think is somewhat important. Just general kind of unit circle and common angles stuff. So, for example, you should have this memorized. Sine, cos, tan, 30, 45, 60. Now, on my this picture will be available on my website. Well, the picture, no, you just go back and watch the video later because I'm not gonna be able to get this up tonight. But anyway, you should know this by heart. The common sine, cosine, and tangents of these degrees, because sometimes in the no calculator section, they will ask you for the sine of these degrees, and if you don't know it, and you don't have a calculator, you're in trouble. The other little fact to know is that the sine of an angle is equal to the cosine of the complement of that angle. In other words, 90 minus theta. This is a little factoid that if you know this, it can make even the hardest trig question pretty darn easy. Things you don't need to know. So you don't need to know law of sines, law of cosines, secant, cosecant, cotangent, trig identities, trig graphs, trig equations. None of that stuff is relevant. Just really this stuff in the screen. SOHCAHTOA, radians and degrees, unit circle, common angles. So really kind of what you learned when you first learned trig. Certainly nothing from pre-calc. Okay, question which relates both to SAT and ACT. How do you find the area of a sector in a circle? So, circle questions relating to arc length and sector area. The most important thing to know. So let's say we had this thing right here. Let's say we were told that this is 40 degrees, and let's say the radius is 10. Just making this up. And let's say I wanted to know what is the area of this sector. The most important thing to know is the central angle, because this tells you what fraction of the circle you're dealing with. Because there's 360 degrees in a circle, you take the central angle that you're given, you put it over 360, and in this case, it tells me that this wedge is 1/9 of the whole circle, which means if I find the area of the circle, which in this case pi r squared is 100 pi, all I'd have to do to find the sector area is just take 1/9 of it. So it would be 100 over 9 pi, whatever that would turn out to be. So the key insight for these questions, central angle, put that over 360, it tells you what fraction you've got. And then you can get the sector area and the arc length, because that arc length would just be a fraction of the circumference. So that key insight, is that central angle. Finding that, you'll find the key to everything. All right. What formulas and equations do I need to memorize for the SAT math section? So this is on top of the ones that I do have up front, which I just showed you. Here are some additional ones you want to know. Slope formula. So y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. Quadratic formula. So negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. You want to know that. The discriminant. So this is b squared minus 4ac, and then what the three scenarios mean. So when b squared minus 4ac is greater than 0, equal to 0, less than 0. What else? Midpoint formula was probably useful to know. Vertex form of the parabola. Formula, a standard equation of a circle. What else? All these things are covered in my math course, as a side note. Any other major ones I'm missing? The trig ones, so like SOHCAHTOA, the stuff we mentioned above. There are any other major ones that I'm missing off the top of my head? Lines, slopes. Kind of related to this, back to lines, the slope-intercept form. So that's y equals mx plus b. Probably all you would need. Things like the axis of symmetry, negative b over 2a. Probably useful to know. And there are probably some other minor ones, but I think these are the major ones. So if you know these off the top of your head, you're in a good position to do pretty well on the math, on top of the formulas that they already include in the front of the book, or in the front of the test. Okay, another question about SAT. What's a good number of times to take the SAT, and can you superscore, or will colleges just see all your scores? So the number of times to take it depends. Again, I hate to keep doing this, but it really does depend on your situation. I'd say a good target is 2 to 3. I think most people probably take it closer to 3, most people who are looking for a competitive score at least. So 3 is a good target generally. Whether or not you can superscore or whether colleges will see all your SAT scores, it depends on the college. Every college has their own policy. In the end, it doesn't really matter. Don't freak out too much about, oh, I had a really bad SAT score the first time I took it. All they want to see is, what was your best score? And maybe some idea of the progression you made. But don't worry too much about, oh, what if they see that I took the test 5 times? Or what if I got a low score a couple times? That doesn't matter. Just do your best to get the highest score you can. That's all that really matters when it comes to college admissions. How to focus during the SAT test. So, a few things here. Part of it is practice and experience. I don't envy students in your situation, you guys growing up in this environment. So I took the SAT back in 2001, literally 16 years ago. And it was very different. We didn't have cell phones. We didn't have internet, wasn't as much of a thing as it is now. Not as many distractions. Not that we didn't find distractions, but the media environment you guys live in today, it's made me a distracted mess. So I can only imagine how many of you might feel. And so the challenge with the SAT is you got to sit in place for 3+ hours doing the test. And that is hard to do for anybody, but especially in these circumstances. So part of it is practice, part of it is focus, practicing that focus, which you could only get by doing full practice tests timed. So that's the main thing. And then what that does, besides building your stamina, is let you know what you need to pay attention to and what you don't. It helps improve your efficiency so that you don't have to think as hard to get answers to questions. And the less hard you have to think, the more energy you conserve, the more you can focus later in the test. So there's really no like 1 or 2 things I can tell you that, boom, tomorrow will make you like the most perfectly focused person in the world. What it comes down to is that practice, that repetition, learning the test really well, and that helps smooth everything out. I'm a very slow worker. Do you think doing many ACT practice tests would help me improve my time management? For sure. Just like, this is related to the last question, right? So this is true for both SAT and ACT. Doing practice tests can help you with stamina, with focus, can help you just get familiar with strategies. So absolutely doing practice tests is important for time management and for just getting questions right. The one thing I would say is don't just do only practice tests. I think the biggest mistake that students make prepping for both the SAT and the ACT is just doing practice test after practice test. Like full tests. So if you do practice test and then maybe check your answers a little bit, and then you do another practice test and then maybe check your answers a little bit, and then another practice test and you check your answers a little bit, that's not the best way to approach things. Practice tests should really be done maybe maximum once every 2 weeks. Once every 3 weeks is probably better. What you should be spending most of your time doing is timed practice sections, reading working through prep books, doing worksheets and exercises. If you're a member of my website, which you can join for free, watching videos, so videos for the different sections, videos for different concepts. Most of your time should be spent doing that because that's where you're learning. The issue with practice tests is you don't really learn doing practice tests. Practice tests really kind of tell you where you're at, and they can help improve your stamina. You're not really going to learn as much doing a practice test. Where you learn is, reviewing your answers, reading books, going through prep books, doing exercises, watching videos, doing tutoring, doing classes. That's where you learn. So practice tests should only be once in a while to make sure that you're on the right track, you get a score, you know where you're at, things like that. Question related to the ACT, but it also applies to the SAT. So this is a good question for everybody to think about. If there is a question that takes a while to work out, is it worth it on the ACT to take your time and work it out, or make your best guess to be time conscious? More so the latter. And I would just kind of add to this, like maybe the third option is skip and return later. Especially on the ACT, where time is much more time pressure than it is on the SAT, but even applies to the SAT. Again, I think I mentioned this earlier, but it's so important, I just want to reiterate it. Spending time in the middle of a test working on a hard problem that you have to spend time and effort figuring out is a bad move. Skip it, come back to it later. You want to get all the easy stuff done, then worry about the hard stuff at the end. A lot of times people will say, well, wait a minute, I need a lot of time to finish the problem, so I want to do it like in the middle of the test so I have enough time? Well, yes, but your time is not your time is not infinite. You are taking time away, potentially, from easy and medium questions. The big thing you want to avoid, and I talk about this a lot in my videos, I call it the doomsday scenario, is let's say you're doing a SAT or ACT science section, and let's say this is number 12, which is the middle of the section or something, and let's say it's really hard, and let's say you spend 5 minutes on it. And because you spend 5 minutes on it, you don't have enough time to finish the section, and you have to guess or rush on easies and hards. And let's say, for the sake of argument, you still get this question wrong. So what have you done? You have now spent 5 minutes on a question that you've ended up getting wrong anyway, and now you've had to rush through easy and medium questions later and get those wrong too. That is horrible, right? That's a terrible outcome. You don't want that to happen. So you have to identify, oh, this one actually seems hard. I'm going to circle it. I'm going to come back later. This is the core of time management. This is the core of being efficient. And so you want to get in the habit of doing that. What are the best resources to study for the Math 2 subject test, SAT subject test? And should you take subject tests on the SAT if you're taking the ACT? So I'll answer the second question first because that's easier to answer. It depends. You have to look at the colleges. Some colleges say if you take the ACT, you don't have to take subject tests. Other colleges want both ACT and subject tests. Other colleges don't want subject tests at all, no matter what. So it depends on the college. So check with the colleges that you might be applying to get an idea of what they would expect. In many cases, though, if you take the ACT, you don't have to take any subject tests. But again, it depends on the college, so check with them. As for the first question, best resources for Math 2 subject test, this would also apply to Math 1 and chemistry. The most important thing to get is the official guides. They have official guide from the College Board for Math 1 and Math 2 and for chemistry. You absolutely want that because that has a couple real tests in it from each test. So that's important. Really, in terms of third-party prep book, Barron's I usually go to. It's usually harder than the real thing, but if you get that and something like a Princeton Review, which is easier, it's a good mix. You can get some harder and easier stuff. And so here comes plug alert. So if you go to my website, reasonprep.com, members.reasonprep.com, if you just change the category to SAT subject tests, I have courses on SAT chemistry, Math 1 and Math 2. I also have a bundle. If you're doing both, like let's say math and chemistry, you can get access to these here. Basically, I go through a lot of practice problems, basically review these very quickly, kind of like a crash course for both chemistry and Math 1 and Math 2. So obviously, I would recommend that. But if you're looking for something more in terms of books, then the official guide is an absolute must. Barron's, Princeton Review, third-party stuff just for the content review is good. And then maybe a mix of like a Barron's and a Princeton Review is perhaps a good way to go. Okay, next question. In terms of timing, I think I'm going to do this a little bit longer than normal, but I think I'm going to end closer to 9:15, so that would be in about 20 minutes. So if you had any burning questions you want to ask, feel free to get them in before then, and I'll try to get to them. But yeah, we're going to end in about 20 minutes, 20-minute warning. Are complex passages to be attempted first or last? This is a easy question to answer last. You definitely always do harder passages, more complex passages last. So for the SAT reading, this would most likely be history passages, dual passages, and maybe fiction. On ACT reading, probably, it depends there. Most of the time, like fiction, you usually do last. Depends on what your strengths and weaknesses are. And then same thing with ACT science, do shorter passages first, harder passages, longer passages later. If you just completed an AP course, is it the optimal time to take the subject test, or should I still study for it? Well, both. So you definitely, like, let's say we're talking about chemistry, just as an illustration. Let's say you're taking AP chemistry and you're going to take the subject test. You definitely want to take the subject test close to when you finished your AP test. So that would either be May, which may be a tough slog because you're studying for the AP at the same time, or then perhaps best option would be June. So you definitely want to take it sooner rather than later, but you also want to study for it because there is differences between the tests, AP chemistry, subject test in chemistry, your math class and math 1 or math 2, physics, biology, literature. You want to get used to the test format and the test questions. You definitely should study for it, even if you've taken an AP. An AP is going to really prepare you very well, but you want to get experience with the tests because they can be weird. Like the subject test in chemistry, for example, is pretty weird compared to the AP or probably any test you've taken for it. So you want to get used to the format, the question types. For Math 2 and Math 1, you want to be familiar with the content and the things you have to learn, which you may or may not have learned in pre-calc. So definitely take these closer to APs and also definitely do some prep for them as well.